It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody here today on such a gorgeous day. So I acknowledge everybody probably has some gardening or something outside that they would like to be doing. It's been a long 6 months in Vancouver where we've had a very long and wet spring, and it feels very celebratory to be back here in the room here with the doors open on such a gorgeous day. So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Reed Shire. I'm the director of the Polygon Gallery. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. And I want to express my gratitude particularly to the members of the Squamish Nation for the opportunity to conduct our work here and to welcome all of you here today. It's an immense honor to welcome Dr. Mark Seeley to Vancouver for the first time and here to the Polygon, and Ken Montague back to Vancouver to discuss an enormously terrific exhibition of the works from his collection. And I just want to offer my personal thanks as we get going here for the opportunity to come together here toward the end of the exhibition to talk about it with all of you and to celebrate what I think is a terrific accomplishment of the work of Elliot Ramsey, our curator, who has brought it all together. I want to thank Emily Wall and all the team at the Capture Photo Festival who are co-presenting the talk and the exhibition with us, and for all their support throughout the duration of As We Rise. Emmy is going to say a few words in a minute, but I want to express my personal gratitude to her for all her support. This exhibition was organized by Aperture in New York, who began the conversation with Ken about his collection becoming a book. The book spurred the exhibition, so in a kind of reversal came first. There are many copies of the book outside. I'm going to put Ken on the spot and say that after this talk, he will be happy to sign copies of the book should anybody here want to purchase one. We've got lots. But my thanks to Aperture. And also to Barbara Fisher at the U of T Art Museum, who I think began the conversation with Ken about turning the book into an exhibition, and with whom we have collaborated on bringing it into the current form. And I'm grateful to Barbara for her collaboration and for our conversation. She's a real treasure. Finally, before I invite Emmy up, this show is supported by the Andrew Gruft Fund for Photography, which was set up in honor of Andrew and his passion for shows just like this. And I want to thank everyone who continues to support the fund, which gives us the opportunity to bring shows like this to Vancouver and to organize events like this talk we're about to participate in. Andrew was passionate about dialogue about photography. And I know he would be seated front and center today, this afternoon. And I just want to acknowledge him and all the people that have supported his legacy. So thank you for coming. Emmy, where are you? There you are right there. Emmy Lee Wall.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Emmy, and I'm Capture's Executive Director. Thanks so much for being here on the sunniest day this year so far. It's really nice to see you all. One of the best parts of my job is meeting people like Ken. A friend once described him as a national treasure, and I don't disagree. I had the great pleasure of touring his home and collection about 1.5 years ago and was really blown away by what he had built over time. As he showed me the proofs of his catalog in the design phase, he told me that the book and show, As We Rise, was named after something his father used to say, "We lift as we rise," suggesting the importance of giving back to the community, something Ken has done in spades. He's been the first to really show many of the artists that have participated in Capture, and I'm truly delighted he's here today. And Mark, I first met Mark about a year ago, and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at Contact, where he was in conversation with Tyler Mitchell. At the end of the question period, Mark read aloud something he had prepared, summing up Tyler's work that was so poetic, so moving. I swear half the audience was in tears when he was done. I swear Darcy was like tearing up. I mean, he's very emotional, but he really was. And I decided then and there that I really wanted to have him come to Capture and to Vancouver, so I'm super thrilled he's here today. Thank you to everyone at the Polygon, especially Reed and Elliot, for hosting this talk and for allowing us to use your beautiful space to celebrate Capture's closing as well. And we're super grateful to you for your continued support year over year as we grow our community together. And Elliot, congratulations for such a truly beautiful installation of As We Rise. It's really remarkable. And I really want to thank everybody who's participated in Capture this year. This is our second last day, but our last official event and our closing reception. So I really appreciate every single person who's come to our events, our talks, seen our exhibitions, and our public art. So I hope you enjoy this talk. I'm just as excited as you are to hear Mark and Ken in conversation. And I'm just going to invite Elliot to say a few words, who's the curator of this amazing exhibition.
Thank you, Emmy. I don't really have words prepared other than to introduce our two speakers formally, but congratulations on another successful Capture Photography Festival. It's always such an honor to take part, and this has been such a beautiful festival this year, and really honored that As We Rise is one of the featured exhibitions in it, so thank you. I also want to thank someone who's not on stage with us today, but is here, Emily Croning, who is such a big part of the Wedge Collection, has worked so hard to make these works available, get this project off the ground, worked with Ken and Aperture in bringing first the book together and the show. So Emily, I'm super grateful to all of your efforts as well. Without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers, who I'm so excited to have with us today, Dr. Kenneth Montague. Dr. Kenneth Montague is a Toronto-based dentist, art collector, and founding director of the Wedge Collection and Wedge Curatorial Projects, a nonprofit arts organization. Since 1997, Ken has been promoting both emerging and established artists via exhibitions, lectures, and workshops. His focus is African Canadian and Diasporic art, which he also showcases in his privately owned Wedge Collection. He's served on the African Art Acquisition Committee at the Tate Modern, as well as the Photography Curatorial Committee at the Art Gallery of Ontario. He's currently an AGO trustee, as well as an advisor to their Department of Arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora. He is a frequent panelist at international art symposiums, including Bamako Encounters, Biennial of Contemporary African Photography, and Black Visualities, Lisbon. And he has been invited to lecture on contemporary art at the National Gallery of Canada, the Smithsonian's National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Studio Museum in Harlem, among others. For his efforts in supporting the arts and his mentoring of emerging artists, Ken received an honorary doctorate from OCAD University, Toronto in 2016. Ken, welcome. And Dr. Mark Seeley, we are so grateful and honored to welcome you to Vancouver. Dr. Mark Seeley, OBE, a most excellent order of the British Empire. That's in there too. Is executive director of Autograph and professor of photography, rights, and representation at University of Arts London. Dr. Seeley is interested in the relationship between art, photography, and social change, identity politics, race, and human rights. He has written for many of the world's leading photographic journals, produced numerous artist publications, curated exhibitions, and commissioned photographers and filmmakers worldwide. Lawrence and Wishart have published Seeley's most recent critical writings on photography. These include titles such as Photography, Race, Rights, and Representation, published last year, and Decolonizing the Camera, Photography in Racial Time, 2019. You can always count on Ken to bring show and tell. It's amazing. It's like, that bag is like bottomless, honestly. Without further ado, I mean, we can jump in. There's so much that we could talk about with this exhibition. exhibition. Both of these gentlemen have such expertise on so many of the works in the show. By way of guiding this conversation, we've selected 5 pairs of images from the exhibition, one from the UK, the other from Canada, which have some, thematic connections that we can explore, but can be the basis for a series of short conversations that I will try to keep on track. I'm not good at this because I could listen to these two talk all day, but I will try to keep things within the hour or so. So without further ado, please take it away.
So I think the best thing to do is to think about how the dialogue with Ken begins in many ways. I mean, we're a small visual arts organization in London. We're kind of impoverished. We're hustling and trying to make a kind of platform for artists to have a voice within, trying to gain relevance, trying to give the work what could be easily termed now as a degree of care, degree of value, trying to pressure the very conservative photographic communities up and down and around the world about how a community of artists are trying to take responsibility for the spaces and places that they deem, I suppose, precious to them. And it's a kind of rare moment, really, when someone from overseas knocks on the door and says, actually, we're really interested in what you're doing. I'm really kind of trying to build something. And of course, you look at someone like Ken, who's there, and you're like thinking, you for real? Is this a serious conversation? And we're trying to work each other out. You're trying to, people have got very little time. And the idea that someone wants to purchase something, say someone like Van Lee Burke's work at the time, certainly pricked up my attention to, the opportunity that Ken was offering. And I think that's the key word. And that opportunity is really quite rare, because that opportunity says something like, I'm curious, I'm intelligent, I want to build something, I want to value something, and I want to hear who you think or what you think is valuable to the thing that I'm trying to do. So this is maybe mid-90s, around about the year 2000. And of course, in that moment, you're thinking, well, you really do want to start at the beginning. You really want to start with practitioners who've done the heavy lifting, who've done the kind of legwork. They're not particularly theoretically grounded in their work. They're not particularly technically brilliant in the things that they've been addressing. But what they have done is that they've made a really important contribution to visualizing those communities, especially those communities outside of London that needed a kind of place of recognition. So we're in that place of kind of thinking about how do we build a representative field of those communities that have been historically marginalized, pushed into the background, and very rarely brought into the public realm. Autograph itself is a very precarious organization. It starts in 1988. It's a precarious organization because it's what was called then annual revenue funded. Annual revenue funding meant that every year you might get your funding again, which means that halfway through your funding cycle, you're already thinking about what you might have to do next year to get your funding. It's not a basis for future thinking, it's a basis for survival. So you're in that perpetual game of survival kind of tactics. Part of what I was doing was bringing a kind of a mythology, if you like, to what Autograph was about, creating a kind of amplified space where people were believing, real or not, that there was a huge body of work that had been systematically ignored that you all needed to kind of take purchase of. That was the kind of amplification game that I was in. Key to that was publishing. Key to that was creating platforms like this where artists were beginning to speak. And key to that was trying to get people to invest in the kind of the building blocks of what these practitioners potentially had to offer. Van Lee Burke, Boy with Flag, an incredibly important photograph in a sense because it talks about so many ideas which were being contested about the role of black British subjects at that time in the 70s. Outside of the frame of this photograph, it looks really calm, doesn't it? Nice boy, little bike, British flag, having a good day out. But outside of the frame of this is an incredibly hostile environment around black presences in the UK. The National Front are not far away from him. my reading of this boy in a bike is that, he probably needed that bike to get home safely in the highly contested political space that he was representative within. So it made sense in many ways when someone like Ken was coming through the door to try and get this work into a growing collection as a starting point, for a dialogue with what was happening around Black British photography at that time. I mean, one of the things I really want to say about the way that we were using blackness as a kind of term in the 80s was not necessarily through the kind of epidermal schema of it all. It was one which we can talk about maybe later. It was one about a sense of consciousness. Blackness for us was a way of thinking, a way of being, and a way of being an oppositional voice in the context of the kind of really difficult times that we were going through as kind of others in a kind of very imperialized British contemporary cultural way. So this photograph for me was something that I thought opens up so many dialogues, so many ongoing conversations about how history, time, and location, and if you like, the journey to a new identity begins for young Black subjects of this kind of nature. So the flag, the bike, the sign of mobility, the kind of posture, the confidence, the pleasure that is exhumed from an image like this become, I think, a really good starting point for understanding the kind of what's the space, the difficulties, the ambiguous nature of what it means to be a Black subject in Britain. And if you're going to collect the image of that space, if you're going to join these diasporic kind of conversations, it's great actually being in water here, because all of it is about that kind of watery pathways that people have kind of traveled.
The Black Atlantic.
The Black Atlantic. Yeah. Well, the Black Pacific is coming, I hear, so it's all good. They're on it. So that's why I think these images have such a growing resonance, really. And I think through Ken's work of collecting it and making it accessible to people and joining the dots with other, if you like, presences, that we can begin to value this work in an incredibly and different historical trajectory into the work that images do in culture.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I have to say, I remember meeting you after seeing the book Different. So that was probably end of the 90s. And, a great book that was co-authored by Mark and his mentor, Stuart Hall, who was someone who I started reading, a cultural theorist, Jamaican and British. And there was just so much synergy in, what you were talking about in that book, difference and sameness, thinking about the Black body, thinking about, being and becoming, as Stuart would say. And, that I will talk about Dawit's image in a moment, but I have to finish and say I was born in Windsor, Ontario, just across from Detroit, Michigan. And my parents are both from Jamaica and came as early immigrants to Canada way before the Pierre Trudeau years with multiculturalism. They came in the 50s. I was born in the 60s. And, growing up being that only Black kid in the class and the only Black family in the neighborhood, it was seeing that kid on that bike in that picture. I remember being that kid, with my little Canadian flag, with my banana split, seat bike, and, 70s kid. Never as cool as Winfred in that photo, but the idea of, saying this is who I am really resonated with me. I mean, it was such a distinct image of identity, cultural identity, and I'm going to say this is who I am. So, that really started us on a journey, seeing that image in that book. And then I think cold calling you, I was going to London, and I remember meeting you and Stuart in the old autograph office, and so that image in a lot of ways put us on a journey too, together. But the image on the right is Dawit Petros's iconic work, Sign, which is in the show and is kind of a signature image. That work I bought from the artist just after he produced it. I think in 2003 it was produced, and we had a show of his work with my nonprofit Wedge Curatorial Projects in Toronto in 2006. But the work itself is student work. He was at Concordia University doing his BFA, and it was his thesis. It was taking people in his class as models and kind of reinscribing, classic images in the Western canon, Dutch masters paintings. This is taken after Albrecht Dürer's, self-portrait at age 29, year 1500, a famous European painting. And this idea, well before Kehinde Wiley and others doing these, great masters paintings and rethinking this. Eritrean Canadian student, had this great idea, this simple, powerful idea to sort of rethink about these images. And of course, we placed this image in the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and had an opportunity to do a show there and put it in the Polygon Gallery and amongst the big European paintings of Wolfe and Montcalm and our kind of European forefathers. And so it has a lot of resonance for me personally as images that interrupted that story. And we all have our grand stories of the colonial stories, and that was one that we needed to break up in Canada. So that image means a lot to me for kind of the journey that it's been on. Happy to have it in a collection. Continue.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You go ahead, Mark.
Black Lives Matter and Horace Ove. Horace is an incredible figure. This is an image which shows Michael X arriving at Paddington Station with his entourage. Michael, an incredibly controversial figure on so many levels, but Horace is even equally more controversial in many ways because he kind of is one of those uncompromising black artists that simply says, I am what I am. I'm going to deal with you the way that you've been dealing with me, and is drawn to those kind of places of tension within the work and that kind of atmosphere of the internalization of blackness is what Horace's work, I believe, is all about. I think one of the key things really is about how we think through not just the external aspects of making lives visible, is how we think about that kind of Fanonian aspect of the psychology of dealing with those racialized ideas. Those ideas that are positioned and put on you, those ideas that you want to think through, the way that we internalize and protect or have to manage the kind of psychology of kind of race is really important within Horace's work. He's one of the few early black filmmakers that tried to do that within the understanding of the framing within his work. And it's not surprising that he's drawn to those kind of sometimes hyper-masculine spaces. Sure. Can you hear me? All right, got competition with seagulls. Kind of naturally pull the thing down, but never mind. He's drawn to those kind of hyper-masculine kind of ideas around how you kind of work through those how you work through those confrontations. Both the inside world and the external world is really important. And I think when we look at this kind of, those kind of protected characteristics around black masculinity that often amplify themselves through, collective groups dressed the same, black polo necks, black leather jackets, having to kind of almost march into the public space simply to be present, to be protected, the sense of numbers, the sense of community, the sense of politics, the sense of kind of black British Black Panthers, the idea that they're learning so much, there's so many, like the Atlantic here is present not just through the politics, what Michael X was about. It's of course referring to Malcolm X. It's of course referring to the trans-political Pan-African politics of what change meant. A photograph like this, and through the lens of this presence, means that you're in a kind of international, global movement that is contesting in a kind of what only can be described as a third way of being. That third way of being says, we want change, and that change is going to be uncompromising. And if that change is uncompromising, then it's not far away from violence. And I think that's the kind of edge that an image like this brings to the table. And you can see that edge because of what's going on again around not just the central figures, but the awe, the shock and awe of the other people around the platform. It's like, what is going on here today? There's so much confidence and so much exuberance. That happens now, of course, through many forms of popular culture. But the radical act of doing that in a public station like London's Paddington Station in the 1960s was a brave act, right? An incredibly brave act. So in many ways, it feels quite a kind of like, staged image, if you like. But the politics of that are really quite important to actually capture that moment of exuberance and political assertion through Horace's work.
Yeah, and the image on the right is Jelani Morgan's photograph of the the first sort of organized protest of Black Lives Matter Canada movement in Toronto in 2014, and it's a die-in. It's a kind of a way of protesting where people all around the world, but particularly in North American cities, were just beginning to come together to think more deeply and protest killings by police that were, in this case it was Eric Garner in 2014 who was murdered by police in New York, and just the police were never charged. It was such an outrage, and this is well before George Floyd. This is 2014, but if you know the city of Toronto, it's a very familiar place. It's Dundas Square. You can actually see the little sign that says Yonge Street with the bus stop. And so for Canadians, in particular Torontonians, this is a very resonant image. It's you can, as I say, you can sort of hear the silence in it. People were lying down, playing dead for 5 minutes. There's a little baby in carriage and older people. The artist Jelani Morgan was part of this movement, this burgeoning movement, and he also, as a photographer, recognized the importance of this moment and ran upstairs. And if you know Toronto, there's a movie theater, an AMC movie theater at Dundas Square, and he ran up and got this bird's eye view of the crowd. And, later on, this image was shown in Toronto's photography festival, Contact, much like your Capture Festival. And when it was shown just 2 years ago, it was done on vinyl and done at Metro Hall, at our kind of city hall, with large posters, not unlike this size that we see it projected. And someone vandalized it. Someone, tore it up, and the artist stitched it back with red thread, like sort of like thinking about the blood spilled, and we left it like that. And then subsequently that work has been purchased. The physical work that was damaged and vandalized was purchased by the Art Gallery of Ontario and is now on display for the first time there. So it has an interesting story as an image, and what we think about it, the memory, but also the image itself in terms of photography, what it has done for people, what it has done to people in terms of it having its own violence imposed on it as an image. Very interesting. We have a long way to go, obviously, in Canada, and that image is proof. Yeah. Next.
Oh, gosh.
Rotimi.
Rotimi Fani-Coyote, my word. Rotimi is... he's almost like the DNA of the work that we've been doing. A transgressive, queer, African artists living and working in the front line in Brixton in the, late 80s, early 90s, dies in 91 of HIV-related illnesses. Tragic end to a beautiful career. One of the first chairs of Autograph. You have to forgive me, I always get very emotional when I think about Rotimi's potential in terms of the work, because it's a living work. It's still a work that I'm working with, if you like. We're still working through it. We're still bringing it to a kind of public attention, and there will be a new book coming out on his work in 2024, which I'm just in the middle of doing. But if there is an inspiration, the thing about the work for me, in terms of Autograph and the journey we've been through, it's never really been about the kind of photography, and it's never really been about art history. It's always been about the kind of dynamic that the work can do, the things that the work can offer, the conversations that are there. And I think sometimes we get lost with what film they're using, when was it done. What Rotimi was trying to do was kind of have a quest for freedom, a quest for sexual freedom, a quest for desire, a quest for love, and using the camera to kind of think about what it means genuinely to be an outsider in terms of geography, in terms of desire, and in terms of being the kind of kid that his parents wanted to be. This is a kind of Nigerian Yoruba prince who comes to London and finds himself in an incredibly complex set of relationships in a way that he can identify with. And one of the things that I love about, metropolitan spaces like London, particularly in the 70s, in the 80s, is that you could disappear. You could become something else. Lots of people were drawn to the kind of visual art places to reinvent themselves, to become the thing that you could imagine, to have the imagination blossom into something real, to have a kind of conversation around blackness, otherness, love, desire, sex, class, race, and not be framed, if you like, by the cultural baggage that we're all given as kind of young people to be. And Rotimi, for me, through the arc of his work, this idea of taxing Yoruba culture within the kind of history of European or Eurocentric ways of seeing is a truly transgressive space of making. And I think that's why I kind of I lost, if you like, in the radicality of what he was trying to produce as an artist. And it will always, always be kind of significant in terms of my own life's trajectory into thinking about the work that images can do. So much so that he's now being picked up by a body of artists, people like Zanelli Mahuli, who you will know, central really to her understanding and formation as a kind of young queer artist working in South Africa. And I was with huge pleasure when Ken kind of accepted the idea of buying a piece of Rotimi's for the collection, because I think in time he will probably become one of the most significant black artists to have been working in that time and in that particular period. Rotimi Fani Coyote.
Yeah, thanks. That's great, Mark. Image on the right is one work. It's made up of 4 images, but the work is by Anique Jordan, who is an artist who family is from Trinidad but grew up in Scarborough, Ontario, outside of Toronto. And she is at Yale now doing her MFA. And very interestingly, this work is about memory. And for people in Toronto, it's a history lesson too, because people don't realize that where our new City Hall is, a famous building in Toronto, 1960s structure, there actually it's the site of the first and most important church for black folks, a BME church, Episcopal church, that was a meeting place for a lot of formerly enslaved people who were coming through the Underground Railroad and getting to Canada. That early community of blacks that arrived from that perilous journey out of slavery and coming to Canada, many ended up in southern and southwestern Ontario, where I was born. Windsor, Amherstburg, Buxton, Chatham, Blenheim. These places are very kind of well known as stops on that Underground Railway, where people were helping these people move away from, get out of this untenable situation and into freedom or something close to freedom in Canada. So that church is a sacred place. And when she went to reenact a scene, to sort of have her congregant from that church in period kind of dress go to the site and kind of take pictures to think about it, that very day she could not gain access because it was a construction site. And ironically, it's where the new courthouse in Toronto has gone up. And when she went there, not having access, she decided to still go for it and do the image. And of course, she has her model in the 4 cardinal points, north, south, east, west. And there's a kind of an imagery that's drawn onto the hoarding. There's a bunch of things that are so interesting there. The hand that's, the construction sign that's saying "stay out" was such a literal thing. She couldn't get access to just behind there, which is where the church was. And so it ends up being this, we never can really be in the place where, you want to celebrate, still being excluded. That's what I read out of it, although I think the artist's intent was much more on the lines of something spiritual, something thinking beyond, the written history. It's more about the black imaginary. What was here at this time? Where are we going? So it's a kind of ode to Black Toronto. And, as a collector who's from Toronto, you see today I'm focusing a lot on images that mean a lot to me geographically, where I'm from. but I think it resonates, and it is something that we can all think about in terms of, the movement of people. I think her work is really important. Anique is moving forward and using her own body, thinking about being Black in Canada as a Black woman, where she is, where she wants to go. I feel like it's a really important art practice to follow. So I encourage all of you to look up Anique Jordan and see what she's up to, one of our great young artists.
South London, obviously.
Liz Johnson Arthur.
Liz, yeah, absolutely. Again, that sense of a long arc of working with community, really. I mean, the key terms that keep on coming back are this kind of this idea that there are these communities, and then there are communities within communities, and there are people that want to be present to document and capture those everyday moments. And it's only through that kind of sense of being embedded within those spaces that you get these comfortable and uncomfortable kind of encounters. And I think that the everydayness of kind of Black expression comes through Liz's work in that sense. And I think, as a woman, just being in the field, just recording, just, taking that, 35 mil sometimes, that, just having that presence to be there. Because why? I mean, otherwise it becomes a narrative that is written by somebody else. And I think that narrative is really important to be owned. And what's interesting now is that there's so many kind of complex and different voices through the lens of photography that finally mean that we can disrupt that kind of essentializing Black experience. So we end up with these Black experiences, which is a much more nuanced story. And in terms of like Black cultural life, like any cultural life, I mean, keep up if you can, because it's an ever-moving, fast feat of change. And in a hyper kind of digital world, it's moving at such a rate in terms of its, suited relationships. It's stitching across time. It's backwards and forwards. It's digital, it's analog. And it is about trying to broaden out, if you like, that kind of collective archive of her work means that you're joining dots across the visual that you might not necessarily, it only works, her work for me, by the way, when it kind of comes together as a kind of congregation of images, because then you can see the more nuanced attitudes that are ripe in her work. But they all do one thing. They all turn around and collectively probably turn around and say, well, what are you looking at? If not this, then what? And whatever's going on, we're going to celebrate it and we're going to present it as a kind of simple matter of fact. And then when you get that as an archival body, the facts of kind of like historical visual violence against the Black subject get changed.
Yeah, I'll add to that to say it's one of my favorite images in the collection. This young woman with her enigmatic gaze, she's, you don't know if she's being hesitant and, why are you taking my picture? That's what first comes into my mind, that hesitant, a stranger taking your photograph. And then I think of the context. Is it at a funeral? Is it at a concert like Glastonbury or something? Is she outdoors? Is she seems to be dressed up. Is it a school trip? Like, what's happening? So I asked the artist, who I don't know, when I saw this image at I think an art fair on the cover of her catalog, not a well-known artist at that time in the art world, certainly someone who's done a lot of fashion photography and so forth. And so the artist wrote back, no dealer, just between the artist and myself, this is the case in so many of the relationships I have with artists in this collection, they're not so well known at the time. And she wrote back and said, I'm not going to tell you about this image, which was so good, which I love so much. It was she's like, I'm going to leave that mystery, I'm going to leave it alone, leave it open, which is a lesson for me as a collector too. It's like, you don't have to know, the artist, I think it's not so much it spoils it, it's just not as important as, the image itself. And she has, as you're mentioning, this great archive, the Black Balloon Archive, images of Black folks, the beauty of ordinary Black life, it's just this great growing archive of images that she takes at social events, at private events like a funeral, that she takes in the dance club, or, when she's going to her doctor's office. Like, it's just a really important thing to show. We just have this plethora of images of oppression. I'm just tired of it, I love that Liz is just about Black joy, and just, whether there's pain in it or not, it's about this idea of togetherness and community. And she just wants her image. And you're right, it's like more is more.
Yeah.
You know, it was very hard to choose one image in my budget as a collector to, you know, choose the one image. And I thought this enigmatic gaze was the one, but really
But the work also
more is more.
The work also arcs back into The Boy with the Bike, Van Lee Burke's
So
work.
true.
There is a kind of sense that there's a kind of generational passing into making sure that those kind of everyday moments, the church, the meal, this, you know, the day out, the non-special occasion is part of what those albums now, you know, I mean, back into kind of music there. They're track after track after track that build and build and build a kind of almost like a visual but sonic presence. That means the kind of sound of these presences, the visual, the articulation of those are undeniable. And they are not about, not about a decisive moment, not about a great image, but about a body, a thing that kind of layers and layers and layers. And those absences in the past, I mean, this is Du Bois 1900. This stuff, this is the Comanche group. This is like people basically saying we need to put these bedrocks down so that people can begin to visualize themselves, have a different archival space, and even using that term within the work. I'm not a photographer. I'm an archivist. I'm not, I'm not a magnum photographer. I'm in this community, right? I own it. I'm from it, and we're going to record it. And it will take time for those presences to kind of unfold. But at least the good news is that they're there, right? So we can, I don't like the term, but we can discover it. We can find it. We can put it to work in totally different ways to what it might even be imagined in the moment. So when I was working with Van Lee back in the day, he also didn't want to kind of caption the work. He's like, you think about it. You join the dots. You write it up, because the meaning doesn't need to be fixed in the way that we always want to do within the Western canon. It's like the who, the what, the where, the when. We always want to name its meaning. Well, obviously now it changes, right? Images, as I've said before, they move in time. This is what I mean by when we think about images in racial time. We look at these images through the lens of the time of our being. They can't be fixed in that moment. They're unhinged because we come at them in every day and in every way with a different set of knowledge systems. And once you begin to apply those different knowledge systems, we can read these images differently. And that's really important work to be done.
It's perfect. I'll go on to say the image on the right, many of you may be familiar because she's becoming a very well-known Canadian artist, Sandra Brewster, who's a artist and good friend of mine in Toronto. She is of Guyanese descent. Her parents came to Canada from Guyana, and so much of her practice is about the movement of people, about migration, about this story that begins with the legacy of slavery, that's about the Black Atlantic, about, folks coming, against their will to the Americas, to the Caribbean, and, from the Caribbean going to the UK to clean up after the war. We're gonna go to that homeland, the colonizer, England. We're gonna make some money, and then we're gonna go back to Jamaica or to Guyana. And it's migration. People stay, and then that's where the conflict starts. And then she talks so much about our unique history as Black Canadians and living as a second generation Black Canadian like myself. I can really relate to her work. She's trying to show that movement of people literally with this blurring effect, this movement. And, it's actually, she uses a gel transfer process that kind of gives this effect. And, the works are oftentimes done right on the wall, sometimes, in monumental size. There was one at the AGO for the last year that was just incredible, like monumental works. And you feel the presence and the absence of the person. She's also saying, much like Liz Johnson Arthur, we don't need to know the identity of this person. We need to know their story, but we don't need to focus on that face. We're thinking about the fact that we can read that it's a Black individual. We can see that the person is contemporary by how they're dressed. She's wearing a scarf, and we get all these images that think about Canada, wearing the scarf, but it's an image, it's an impression. And I think, I don't have a lot of conceptual work in the Wedge Collection, although it's changing. And this is one of the works that really was a learning thing for me, that you can tell stories with, your straight studio photography, but you also, need to embrace new ways of storytelling. And I think Sandra represents one of our, great new voices in Canada. So look out for her as well. How are we doing for time, Elliot? We're pretty good. Keep it going. All right. How are you all doing out there? Are you good? Interesting. Yeah. It's man. All right.
Raphael Albert.
Raphael.
This was again one of those moments where a family turned up with an archive, and the photographer has been working throughout the '60s, documenting these incredible competitions around.
Your microphone a little closer.
Ideas of Black beauty were, there to be contested. I mean, it's the most important thing to share about this photograph or this body of work is that when we had the discussion in public, there was this kind of split around feminist political voices. There's this sense that the beauty contest was a space of, degradation to women and, not something that could be celebrated in any shape or form, which was great and true, of course. But it was interesting for the Black women in the audience because they were like, well, that's okay for you to be there, but we wanted a place where we can celebrate our beauty as well. We want to have this moment of fun. We want to have this kind of sense that, our bodies too were beautiful. You were in a place where you were worried about, being misogyny and, being objectified. We were beyond being objectified. We weren't even allowed to be objectified. We were just held back out of the whole beauty contest altogether. So these moments were really interesting because this is like living memory. The subjects were there, they were in the room. And Raphael's work was about saying, well, yes, we can have these celebratory moments at the heart of Black beauty. And we recognize the fact that the politics of kind of feminism in the 60s were there. But these people wanted to come out and celebrate themselves as proud, beautiful Black women in the context of this kind of space, right? And it's again that taking over those spaces of visibility, flipping that narrative in a way that becomes much more celebratory at the time of which they wanted to come out and be physical with each other and be celebrated as kind of beautiful people in the context, yes, of competition, but more importantly, in the context of being out in that space, right? Of actually just being physical and present and celebrated. So these photographs, actually, this contest and this moment within his work was one of the few exhibitions where we've had people queuing round the building to get into the space. Really important, really. Why? So the question is, what happened in that moment? What's going on in that space? And what we learned, really, is that the archive, the stories of the past, it's much more important for people to try and much more important for people to share what was going on in this day and in these moments and in these theaters and in these contests than it was in terms of thinking about, the politics of kind of the wider narrative around the position of Black women in society at that time. It was a kind of collection and a celebration that the archival images are kind of in deficit, right? They're just not there. There's just not enough. So every time we now put an image from the archive into the public realm, it generates a huge spike of interest, which says what? It says very clearly that the history of kind of photography has done a very particular role of erasure in terms of these celebratory aspects of Black life. So in many ways, the writing up has still got to be done on this work. The reading of this work has still got to be done. The more nuanced conversations and difficult conversations about these images have still got to be done. But at least now we know this work is kind of out there as an artist prior to this exhibition who nobody had even heard of or even encountered. Probably some of the most important photographs taken around Black British life in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and that name is Raphael Albert.
Sorry, Raphael Albert.
Yeah. On the right, in some ways is a Canadian equivalent, same era, 1970s, June Clark. So June Clark is not on everyone's radar yet, but will be soon. She has a lot of big shows coming up in Canada and institutions here and abroad in America. She, in her late 70s, I think now, has been just recently represented by Daniel Faria Gallery, a great gallery in Toronto. So she's, as an artist, she's achieved representation at this stage of her life, which is great. And someone is working hard in terms of helping her to organize her archives. She is, a lot of ways, a missing link. She's half her life was in America, half in Canada. She's born and grew up in Harlem, She did the coveted Studio Museum in Harlem residency when she was in her 50s, and she left New York with a husband who was not wanting to go to the Vietnam War, was a conscientious objector, and they came to Canada in the 70s, and she ended up being the first Black woman on the photo desk of Toronto Life, our kind of magazine in Toronto, that sort of city life. So she has this incredible archive, going around. So many of these photographs were not published in the magazine. And, she would go to events like Caravana in Toronto, our big festival of Caribbean culture, every August. And these gentlemen are on Toronto Island. They're wearing this, very 70s clothes, very cool, but this is just like Black style that she's documenting, and you end up having this archive, not unlike Jamel Shabazz that you see in there with, a decade later in the 80s in New York with the birth of hip hop, just the person that had the camera in their hand that was doing the documentation, So she did all this work. And on top of that is this incredible conceptual artist that was, very politically minded, thinking about the Vietnam War, thinking about America's place in the world, thinking about your new life in Canada. I think June is a national treasure. She is someone who you'll hear much more about because her brilliance is finally being recognized. And there's just a lot of images like this, the beauty of ordinary Black life, but there's also work that she's done that puts her in line with, so many important artists of the era.
I think, Kent, the key word there is this idea of missing chapters.
Yes.
Unknowns.
Yeah.
It's a kind of curatorial, art historical, photo specialist kind of fault line. The idea that you don't have to. It's interesting, isn't it? All you have to do is walk down. I know it sounds a bit weird, but all you have to do is walk down a high street in Bamako, and you find some of the most important photographs ever to come out of West Africa. Seydou Keita, Malik Sedi Bey. This work doesn't arrive. Very familiar now in terms of photographic histories, but this work, and they're in the collection, of course, this work doesn't arrive into the kind of photographic consciousness until like 1993, 1994. There's a kind of scramble for it. The idea that these people are not in photographic history up until that point is incredible, right? And the idea that people like June and that people like Raphael, this idea that there's so much missing to the story of how photographic narratives and histories are written up is almost a kind of crime in academic sense, the kind of myopic sense of looking only for those things that are familiar to you is a kind of, this takes me back into this whole idea of unlocking and doing decolonizing work in the most kind of profound way, if you like, because I think it's what's radical about what you've done is that you've focused on those voices, right? And there you are as a kind of private collector, buying that through, working through. The idea that scholars and historians are professional in that space and they haven't brought much of this work to attention really is something that, is shocking in many ways.
It always surprised me. I was like, why is this?
And the idea that we have to, the idea that it needed kind of that level of activism and support and investment to bring the stuff into play is really, something that, should not be overlooked. There are so many academic spaces which talk about, the history of photography, the complete story, and with so much missing. So this idea about missing chapters, Black chronicles, writing this thing up in a way now is really pressing and urgent work. So I just wanted to frame that. It's very easy to overlook this and say, I did this work. We were, autograph and us having these conversations. But there are very few people focusing on giving attention to what was going on around these practitioners and the geographies of their lives.
Because it didn't have value in the art market.
Correct.
It was a very strange.
And in many
thing.
ways, it's great that we're all in the room here today, and with the show looks brilliant. But these are rare occasions when so many black practitioners are brought into the frame through a very particular lens. Yes, of course, we know Ukwe and Weezer had done great work with Insight, and I can't remember the name of the other show. Snap Judgment. Yes, we know that, but it's all very late in the day in many ways still, right? It's all fairly recent work still, right? It's 1996, 2000, and 2. These are very precarious histories which still need to. So there's a golden opportunity for brilliant new scholarship to be done through reading this work in many ways, right?
Yeah.
Reading that stuff.
And I challenge.
And it's living history. This isn't. Most of these people are still alive. Right?
Yes. And I challenge,
That's why the publishing aspect of this is it's so
we
pressing.
need more books. We need more writers. I challenge.
And for it to be taught, right? That's the key, right? Because it's still, you can go into many schools and for it not to be taught. You will not find them in the curriculum, most of these artists.
It is true. You have to do your own little research as a student. I challenge young Black folks that are at school now that, I want to be an artist. Well, we have a lot of artists. Like, have you thought about being a critic? Have you thought about being a writer? Have you considered, owning a gallery, being in museums as a curator, as a director, and I'm really, really, at the core of my mission is I want more Black collectors too. There's a difference in putting together a collection like this when the mindset, when the mission is so urgent, when you can relate to those images yourself. It's like your own family photos, I think there's a difference there. And so, I really feel like there's much more in terms of storytelling, much more to be told. And I'm looking for Black voices, So I don't want to be the only person when I go to that room, at Art Basel Miami, and they're showing me this work and I'm the only Black collector. Like, you want to share in this, in the collegiality, but also the joy of it. And it's also about keeping a little for yourself and the idea of generational wealth. Like, we should keep some of these images for ourselves too, So I think about all those things, Yeah, thanks. Yeah.